Okay, so I lied a little bit. Not about the title of this video, I'm actually doing that, but I did say in my first video on this topic that I wasn't going to revisit any of the media I already covered in my Evolution of Dracula video, but I've decided to retcon that because there is still so much to talk about with each of these adaptations. By the way, hello everybody, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Sid Says. It's called that because I'm Sid, and I'm saying things to you. And if you're new here and confused about what the hell I'm talking about, don't worry. This is the second video in my new series where I consume literally every piece of Dracula media ever created, but I'm formatting this series in a way where each video will be perfectly watchable and comprehensible as a standalone piece. The only thing I ask of my viewers is to have some baseline knowledge about the original novel, since I compare each adaptation to that original source material during my reviews. But if you really wanted, you could go watch my first video in this series where I talk about the unauthorized Swedish and Icelandic illegal published fanfics of Dracula, if that sounds interesting or whatever. So now that you're caught up, let's talk about Dracula media between 1897 and 1927. This adaptation was penned by the original author of Dracula, Bram Stoker himself, in order to secure the stage rights for any further play adaptations he possibly wanted to create or sell. This was a common practice at the time to protect authors' works from piracy, but it was also heavily criticized because it often didn't actually prevent piracy from happening. Keep this in mind because we are definitely gonna talk about it later. A lot. But in order to officially secure the stage rights, Bram not only had to write his play and have it published, but also have it performed. And so on the morning of May 18th, 1897, the play was performed in the Lyceum Theatre in London. But before we talk about the play, allow me to provide a bit of background. Bram was able to get his play performed at the Lyceum pretty easily since he had been a manager there since 1878. He had managed to secure his job nearly 20 years earlier by befriending an actor and owner of the Lyceum, Henry Irving. And let's just say their relationship was very close. Henry always came first in Stoker's life, even before his own wife, Florence. In fact, he delayed his own honeymoon in order to start working for Henry. And it was often said that his real marriage was actually with Henry and not Florence. In fact, if you have any background knowledge of Bram Stoker, you'll know that many historians speculate about Bram maybe possibly being a little bit fruity. For one, he had a family connection to notorious gay Oscar Wilde, with whom he shared many interests, including a love for Walt Whitman, another notorious gay who was known for writing poems about being gay. There was also his somewhat suspicious level of devotion to his boss, Henry, so much so that Bram was beside him as he died and was the one to close his eyes and then write a biography on his life. There's Bram's very suspicious letters he penned to Walt Whitman that sound thirsty as hell. His other letters he wrote to friends talking about how he wasn't attracted to his wife, despite her being described as one of the most beautiful women of her time, and also fighting against Oscar Wilde of all people for her hand in marriage. And how he preferred the company of men and that he felt he could never achieve the same level of affection with a woman that he could with a man, and the fact his novel, Dracula, has many, many examples of homoerotic and homosocial undertones. There's also this whole thing with how on his death certificate, it lists one of his causes of death as locomotor axia, which is basically just a nice way to say death by syphilis. However, his death certificate is highly contested by Bram's descendants, who claim that syphilis was overdiagnosed at the time and that everyone was getting that slapped on their death certificates. However, records show that Bram was being treated with arsenic, which was used at the time to treat syphilis. And if he did in fact have syphilis, where the hell did he get it? Because we know for a fact that he wasn't sleeping with his wife. So did he perhaps seek out the affections of a lady of the night? Or perhaps a lady boy of the night? Or even his boss, Henry Irving? We'll never know. But I think the evidence is not looking good for him being straight. But enough about Bram's sexuality. let's get back to Dracula. Interestingly enough, Dracula or the Undead was published and performed 8 days before the novel was even published, which is why it's speculated that this play has 2 titles. Because at the time, Bram was kind of going back and forth between a couple of different title ideas for the book, and it's unclear if Bram or Bram's publisher finally decided on the simple title of Dracula, but either way, the rest is history. The original cast of Dracula or the Undead consists of a Mr. Jones as Dracula. Most historians believe that Mr. Jones was most likely T. Arthur Jones, who was a member of the Lyceum Theatre Company, but since he's only credited as Mr. Jones for some reason, we'll never know for sure. Also, it's said that Bram wanted his maybe lover Henry to play Dracula, but Henry didn't want the role because he thought Dracula didn't have any nuance to his character. Henry thought he was boring. Mina was played by Edith Craig, the daughter of the Lyceum Theatre's lead actress. Jonathan was played by Herbert Passmore, and Van Helsing was played by Tom Reynolds. We also know that there were 11 other actors in the production, assuming the parts of all the other characters in the cast, but we aren't entirely sure who they were. We know that some of them were actors from the Lyceum, but the rest were completely unknown. For all we know, they could have just been some of Bram's friends that he roped into his shit show. Oh yeah, by the way, this play was a shit show. So first of all, this play wasn't even really a play. It was a staged reading. So basically all the actors had their scripts in their hands and were just reading off their lines as they very flimsily moved around the stage to mime their characters' actions on a makeshift set that comprised of standing sets from storage. And if that wasn't bad enough, the script was, for the most part, a copy and paste of the novel. But since there were some scenes that obviously couldn't be shown due to the limitations of the stage, like Jonathan's ride to Dracula's castle, where he encounters a strange coach driver and mysterious lights, Bram had to write extremely stilted and honestly dumb as hell dialogue for the characters to fill in the blanks. Just listen to this monologue Jonathan has to give when he arrives at Dracula's castle. Hi, where are you off to? Gone already? Well, this is a pretty nice state of things. After a drive through solid darkness with an unknown man whose face I have not seen and who has in his hand the strength of 20 men and who can drive back a pack of wolves by holding up his hand, who visits mysterious blue flames and who wouldn't speak a word that he couldn't help to be left here in the dark before a ruin? Upon my life, I'm beginning my professional experience in a romantic way. Holy lack of punctuation, Batman. This seriously reads like a middle school creative writing project, oh my god. And it's literally how the play opens! These are the opening words! And since this play was basically a copy and paste of the book, it was very long. Like, really long. The entire play consists of 5 acts, 47 scenes, and lasted over 5 hours. I could not imagine having to sit through that. I love Dracula, but I would have walked out, my god. Like, this shit was so ass that not even Bram's boyfriend could stomach it. Allegedly, Henry had watched the performance for a few minutes when an audience member asked him how he liked the show. It was said that Henry then shouted, "Dreadful!" so loud that everyone could hear it. I don't know about Bram, but personally, I'd never recover. But I did manage to get my hands on the script for this, and you all better be so fucking grateful, because not only was it a nightmare to track this thing down, but I paid $100 for it. So please subscribe so I can monetize this channel and have some hope of reimbursement on this piece of shit. Anyway, let's read it. So like I said, this play is pretty one-to-one with the book, so I'm only going to point out differences I noticed. First one being that since this is a play now, the characters will say out loud any eternal thoughts from the book, as well as narrate anything that can't be practically shown on stage, resulting in these absolute walls of text or comical asides to the audience. Also, Dracula's name has been shortened to Drac as his line marker, and I thought that was pretty funny since we usually only see that done in adaptations where they want to make him, like, you know, hip and modern. But no, I guess the first time it was done was in the super cool year of 1897. But other than some abridging, like combining conversations or events that take place over weeks in the book into only a single scene in the play, the plot is pretty much identical, but there are a few notable differences. Like, the play has a shorter timeline compared to the book, taking place between early May and late October rather than early May to early January. Lucy has dark hair in the play when she was blonde in the book. I'm not sure why Bram would change this detail other than for casting reasons, but IDK, maybe there's like some deeper symbolism or something. There's no scene of the wolf busting in through Lucy's window, so the play just kind of smash cuts from her being alive to her being a corpse in a coffin. And also Mrs. Westenra just dies with no explanation. They just mention that she's dead, but don't offer anything more than that. The vampire ladies don't die in this version. They just kind of dance around Mina and Van Helsing as they watch Jonathan and Quincy murder Dracula. Speaking of which, there's no clear Dracula death scene. The stage directions talk about Jonathan and Quincy fighting off Dracula's Romani slaves, and then Quincy talks about Mina being safe now, but there's no indication that Dracula has been killed. Also, Quincy lives, I think. The stage directions say that he's wounded, and he talks about being proud of saving Mina before he dies, but once again, there's no clear line or direction that indicate that he kicks the bucket. And lastly, there's no epilogue. Quincy just goes like, "Yay, we did it!" And then the play is over. So yeah, I paid $100 for this. While I didn't necessarily find this play a tough read, I can definitely see how this would have been a nightmare on stage, both as an audience member and an actor. The pacing was also off. Some sections felt like they went on forever, and others felt like they went at breakneck speed. Ultimately, the play would only run for one performance, but it's unlikely Bram ever intended it to be anything other than a single performance. This play was only written to secure the copyright for stage adaptations, which is why it most likely is terribly written. Bram wasn't focused on making it good, he was only focused on getting it done as soon as possible. This would all end up being for naught, though, because Bram would die before he ever sold the copyright or produced an official Dracula play. Bram would die in 1912 of either kidney failure or that other thing we talked about, the same week the Titanic sunk. So, that's kind of cool in a fucked up way. Later that same month, Dracula would have a resurgence due to republishing, but despite this, Bram's wife, Florence Stoker, would still struggle financially since the royalties from Dracula were really her only source of income. The next year, Florence would sell Bram's working notes to his novel at auction, but would only get £2 for them, the equivalent of £200 today or 270 US dollars. And so the next year, Florence would go on to publish Bram's previously unpublished work. Dracula's Guest was a series of short stories written by Bram, but the one we're going to focus on is the title story. Dracula's Guest was originally the opening chapter for an early version of the novel. Florence alleges that the chapter was cut for brevity during the novel's final publication, but evidence shows that this chapter was not submitted to publishing in Bram's finished manuscript, suggesting that he cut the chapter himself before submitting Dracula for review. We don't know exactly why Bram dropped this chapter, but it was possibly because it was superfluous in the grand scheme of things. Dracula's Guest follows an unnamed solicitor making his way to Dracula's castle. Of course, this unnamed solicitor is most likely Jonathan. But as he's making his way through Germany on his way to Romania, he encounters a vampire woman in a graveyard who tries to go get him, but is hilariously struck by lightning before she can. And then Jonathan passes out in the snowstorm, but his life is saved yet again by a big wolf that has laid on top of him to prevent him from freezing to death. It's implied that the wolf was Dracula and that the lightning strike was also caused by him in order to prevent Jonathan's death so that he could eventually make it to Romania and sell all that property to Dracula for his evil plans. That's the very condensed version of this story. If you'd like a more in-depth summary, I'd recommend watching my Evolution of Dracula video. But I can see why Bram would cut this. Not only is it a big waste of time, but it also doesn't make a ton of sense, and it's better to just hold off on all the supernatural stuff until we've actually entered Dracula territory. But yeah, that's basically all I've got for this chapter. There really isn't much to this one, but get ready because coming up next, I have even less information to give you. This Dracula was an unauthorized stage adaptation written in 1917. See? I told you we'd circle back to the piracy. But this isn't the last we're gonna see of it, believe me. But other than the fact that we know for certain this play existed and that it was unauthorized and subsequently disavowed by Florence Stoker, we literally don't know anything else about it. We don't know who wrote it, we don't know if it was ever produced, we don't know shit. So let's move on. This was the first ever film adaptation of Dracula, unauthorized of course, but still the first. It was a Russian production directed by Viktor Turjansky, but other than that, we don't know much about it since it is now considered lost media. Or is it? Because you see, the funny thing about this Dracula adaptation is that we don't know if this bitch is even fucking real. And you might be wondering, if no one knows if it's even real, then who was the first person to claim that it was? And here's an even funnier thing. We don't know that either. The earliest documented claim of the existence of this film comes from a single sentence in the June 1963 edition of the magazine Famous Monsters of Filmland that reads, "Eric Jason, specialist in stage monsters, once told me that he was sure there'd been a Russian version of Dracula." So some real solid evidence there. The second documented mention of the film came from the 1975 book, The Dracula Book by Donald F. Glut, but when asked what his source for this information was, he said the Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine. And the third and last known reputable source mentioning this film was The Vampire Book by J. Gordon Melton, published in 2010. But when he was asked where he got his information, he said he got it from the Vampire Book. And so that still leaves the question of where the fuck did Eric Jason hear about this film? We don't know. But despite this, many websites still claim that this film exists and that it's even currently preserved in a Russian vault somewhere. But the thing that really makes me think this all might be a bunch of bullshit is that if this film were real, like some people claim it is, then why haven't they presented any proof? Just because the film itself might be lost doesn't mean that you can't find proof in other ways. Where's the promotional material? Where's the pay stubs for the cast and crew? Where's the script? Where are the critic reviews? Where are the costumes and sets? Why did no one list this film on their resumes or write about it in their diaries? Why is there not a single shred of evidence this film exists? Except there is some evidence. Because in 2013, user Clara Stanek uploaded 3 minutes of footage from the film that was found in a Serbian film archive. That's amazing, right? After all this time, the 1920 Dracula film was finally confirmed to be real. Or was it? I got your ass again! This shit is fake! What Clara claimed to be footage from the film was actually a hoax, and honestly, I'm surprised that this managed to fool anyone for even a second, because it is not shot like an early silent film at all. Film from this era looked very flat, like you were watching a play from the center of the theater, and they really only used wide shots showing the entire set, or medium shots showing the characters from the waist or chest up. The hoax film, however, is shot from a slight angle rather than straight on. The widest shot it uses is a medium shot, and it also uses close-ups. It's also edited to look black and white when films from this time were more commonly sepia toned. It has no dialogue cards whatsoever, even though the characters are talking to each other the whole time. There's only a vignette at the top of the screen instead of around the entire frame, and the actor who is playing, who I assume to be Jonathan, has such a painfully mid-2010s look to him that it's almost laughable. But despite this hoax and the startling lack of evidence, some people still claim that this film is real and that it was destroyed during the Russian Civil War, or that Eric Jason had mistaken it for a different film entirely. But just like everything else in this section, we don't know for sure. Personally, I don't think this film ever existed, but who knows? Maybe some real evidence will surface down the line and I'll eat my words. But until then, I'm gonna keep yapping. Now it's time for something real. The true first Dracula adaptation that we know of was a 1921 Hungarian film that translates to either The Death of Dracula or Dracula's Death in English. This Dracula was directed by Károly Lajthé. I'm sorry, I tried. In a 1921 trade publication, it was announced that the book would be adapted into a film, though the paper did claim that Dracula was written by H.G. Wells and not Bram Stoker. Not even in death can this man catch a break. Károly's film would be produced by Lapa Film Studio and shot on a rented studio space at the Corvin Film Studio in Budapest. Károly wrote the script with Mihály Kertész, and reduced the cast size down to just 3 main roles. Alright, I'm gonna go for it. Paul Asconas played Dracula, Desdo Kirstes played George, our Jonathan stand-in, and Margit Lux played Mary Land, our Mina stand-in. There was some drama with casting though, when some newspapers reported that the actress Lean Mill would actually be the one to play the lead female role. There are two main theories for why these conflicting reports happened. The first theory is that perhaps Lean Mill was initially cast, but later recast with Margit, and the second theory is that the newspaper just made a mistake, which is very likely since this was the same newspaper that falsely claimed that H.G. Wells wrote Dracula instead of Bram Stoker. But now that the script was finished and he had his cast, Carly first shot all the exterior scenes in Vienna, where he lived at the time, before moving production to the rented studio in Budapest to shoot all the interior scenes. The film may have debuted in Vienna in February of 1921, but this is disputed since there aren't any publications confirming this. The first confirmed premiere was in Budapest in 1923, which would mean that this film was technically not the first Dracula film. However, you could also claim that this technically was still the first, since we have proof of it starting production at least 16 months earlier than the second known Dracula film adaptation. It really comes down to technicalities, but most scholars agree that this is still the first film. But either way, as soon as it premiered, it seemed to just as quickly disappear. We don't know exactly why this happened, but we do know that by the spring of 1923, the film had completely fallen off the face of the earth. And while we still have plenty of records that prove its existence, the film itself is considered lost. Only 2 known stills from the film survive today. But weirdly enough, while we don't have a copy of the film script, we do have a copy of a novella adaptation of the film allegedly written by Lagos Panciel, and published in 1924, although it may have been written as early as 1921. We don't know for sure how close the plot of this book is to the plot of the film, but according to the author, it is intended to be a faithful adaptation. So without further ado, let's talk about the plot of the book and potentially the lost film. So Mary Land is our main character, fuck-ass name by the way, and she's super poor and has to work like all the time so that she can afford her father's care at an asylum because he went insane after his wife died. Mary has a fiance named George who tells her to stop working so hard all the time, but bitch, what the hell do you want her to do? She's got medical bills to pay. That shit's expensive. But it's looking like she won't have to be paying those bills too much longer because her crazy dad is dying. Mary goes to the asylum, promising George she'll return home in the evening. Mary recognizes one of the other inmates as her old music teacher, but when she tries to talk to him, he just keeps saying that he's not her stupid music teacher, he's Dracula. She gets away from him, but then gets jumped by 2 other inmates disguised as doctors, and they try to perform eye surgery on her, but she's saved by a real doctor before that happens. After all that bullshit, Mary finally gets to go see her father, the whole reason she came here to begin with, but he dies like the instant Mary walks into the room, so rip. Mary decides to spend the night at the asylum, but big mistake because Dracula kidnaps her and takes her to his castle. Oh, I guess he wasn't lying about being Dracula. But anyway, he plans to force Mary to marry him, turn her into a vampire, and then add her to his current collection of previous wives. The wives get Mary ready for the wedding, but just as Dracula is about to kiss her at the altar, Mary takes her crucifix necklace and holds it out to stop him. All the vampires run away, and Mary runs out of the castle and into a snowstorm. This was not the best idea since Mary nearly dies, but she's rescued by a family who take her back to their house, but Mary is now in a coma, and then Dracula shows up again. He pretends to be a doctor and tries to take Mary, but then a real doctor shows up, so Dracula fucks off. A few days pass and Mary is getting better, but then a mysterious coachman shows up and tells the doctor that someone's been injured and he needs to come with him. So the doctor gets in the carriage, but uh-oh, the coachman was hired by Dracula and he's kidnapping him. But this guy has no loyalty, I guess, because as soon as the doctor tells him to turn the carriage around and take him back, he does it. But before the doctor can get back to Mary, she kind of tweaks out and decides to run off into a snowstorm again. Mary, you can't keep doing this, girl. But it's fine, I guess, because guess what? It was all a dream. Pretty disappointing. And then I guess the writers just had like no idea how to end this movie, so they just have a random inmate find a gun just lying around in this asylum full of mentally ill people. This is literally the worst hospital ever. And he shoots Dracula with it, killing him. I guess since they named the shit Dracula's Death, they had to kill him somehow. But anyway, Mary and George reunite. Mary is traumatized by her dream. The end. Honestly, I really liked the start of this one. I love how it's centered on Mary as our main character and how the story was reworked for her to almost take on Jonathan's role from the novel with the whole being harassed in Dracula's castle, escaping, and then getting really sick and having to be nursed back to health routine that he's always pulling. But the "it was all a dream" ending really ruined it for me. And the death part of the death of Dracula really felt like an afterthought, even though it's the title of this whole goddamn movie. I wish the film for this still existed because I know that I would have enjoyed this so much more if I got to see all the campy acting. In January of 1921, a new film production company, Pranafilm, was founded by Enrico Deichmann and Albin Grau in Germany. The duo had big dreams of creating a series of macabre and disturbing expressionist horror films, the first of which was Nosferatu. Unfortunately, Nosferatu would also be Prana's last film. Nosferatu was, of course, based on Dracula, which is where the word Nosferatu was popularized. But Bram hadn't made up the word. He had found it in an essay written by Emily Gerard titled Transylvania Superstitions, where she alleged that it was the Romanian word for vampire. In fact, the word Nosferatu is not only not a word in Romanian, but also isn't a word in Hungarian or any other Eastern European languages at all. There are a lot of theories surrounding where Emily Gerard got the word Nosferatu from, but none had ever been confirmed. But regardless, the word has since gone down in history. Henrik would change all the names from the source material. Count Dracula became Count Orlok, Mina and Lucy were combined into one character, Ellen, Jonathan Harker was renamed Hutter, Van Helsing was now Bulwer, and Renfield became Knock. But other than some cuts and minor story edits, the plot between book and film were largely the same. The film opens in the fictional German town of Wisberg during the 1830s. Hutter leaves his wife Ellen to travel to Romania after being requested to go by his strange little boss, Knock, who is definitely not evil. Hutter goes to Romania to sell the house directly across the street from his to Count Orlok, who I would not want as a neighbor. While Hutter is traveling, he spends the night at an inn where he reads a book about vampires and thinks it's the funniest fucking thing he's ever seen. We basically get a shot-for-shot remake of Jonathan's creepy carriage ride from the novel before Hutter arrives at Count Orlok's castle. Count Orlok gets super horny when he sees a picture of Ellen, and then later he jumps Hutter for his blood. Back at home, Ellen has some sort of waifish woman powers to sense her husband is in danger and yells his name, and I guess Nosferatu can sense this and decides to leave Hutter alone. Hutter discovers Orlok's coffin the next day, but it's too late and Orlok is already off to become his new neighbor. We then get a speedrun version of the rest of the Dracula book showing Hutter escaping, then hospitalized, then returned home, not going crazy and being sent to the asylum, and the introduction of Dr. Bulwer doing experiments. And meanwhile, Orlok is eating everyone up on his ship, and when he arrives in Wisberg, a plague infects the town. Ellen reads the super hilarious book about vampires, but she's not laughing. She learns she can kill Orlok by letting him drink her blood until dawn. She does this and Orlok turns into a puff of smoke, marking the first time we'll see a vampire hurt by sunlight in any form of media. The making of the film was pretty novel for its time. Expressionist films relied on creating a heightened sense of reality with specific visual styles like high contrast between light and shadow and elaborate surrealist sets. But Nosferatu didn't really have the budget for the amount of different sets that would be needed to tell the story, so they instead shot on location, that is, they didn't use sets. This also made it more difficult to achieve the striking lighting we see in other expressionist films, but the filmmakers were still able to pull off the effect by carefully planning out their shots. But this movie would be nothing without its title character. The part of the film's Nosferatu would go to actor Max Schreck. Yes, that was his real name. And as a funny coincidence, the surname Schreck is actually the German word for terror. It was like this guy was born to be a horror star. The Count Orlok look was completed with makeup and visual effects, making Max's features look more striking and giving him pointy ears and sharp little rat teeth. I previously said in one of my other videos that the 1958 film version of Dracula was the first film to depict a vampire with fangs, But that isn't necessarily true, because technically Count Orlok has fangs, they just aren't in the usual place we would associate with them being on a typical vampire, looking like an evil Easter bunny over here. Once filming was finished, the Prana film team wasted no time making a spectacle of Nosferatu for the purposes of marketing, creating an endless supply of grotesque artwork that they posted in newspapers, posters, and pamphlets. And during their opening premiere, they even hired a full orchestra to provide musical accompaniment to their silent film. After all was said and done, Prana Film ended up spending far more on publicity than it did on the actual film, and this was the cause of their downfall, but not in the way you may suspect. Back in jolly old England, there was an organization known as the Society of Authors. The Society's purpose was to protect authors' copyright in exchange for a continued membership fee. By this time, Bram Stoker had been dead for 10 years, but his widow, Florence Stoker, had inherited the copyright for Dracula. Now, Florence wasn't a member of the Society of Authors, even though they had continuously reached out to her to ask if she'd like to join. She basically just ignored them. That was until the excessive amounts of advertising for Nosferatu came to bite them in the ass like one of Count Orlok's nasty little rats. Because some of their ads made their way to England, where Florence saw them, and I don't know if you know this, but Prana Film never actually bothered to secure copyright before making their Dracula adaptation. They just thought they could change all the character names and call it a day, but not on Florence's watch. As I briefly mentioned earlier, Florence wasn't in the best way financially. Dracula royalties were her one lifeline, but even those weren't bringing in much. So when she heard about this filthy fucking German film company leeching off profits that should be partially hers, she would make sure they had hell to pay. The next time the Society of Authors mailed Florence about membership, she mailed them back a check along with clippings of advertisements for Nosferatu and a plea for the Society's help to take these rat bastards down. The Society was, of course, willing to help her since she had paid the membership fee, but they were a little bitter that she only decided to join because she needed their help. In any case, they did what they could to settle this affair. Since the copyright infringement was coming from a different country, the Society had to tread carefully due to differing laws. But they managed to secure a German lawyer on Florence's behalf, Dr. Ronker Flatto. Yes, that's also his real name. Unfortunately, despite having legal representation, there wasn't much any lawyer could do for Florence since, well, Prana Film had basically gone bankrupt. Yeah, maybe they shouldn't have blown their load on advertising. But that really didn't matter to Florence. She wanted the money. God damn it. And she knew they fucking had it because even though Prana had declared bankruptcy, they were still showing and making a profit off of Nosferatu even outside of Germany at this point. And now that the film was being shown in other countries, the Society would now also have to enlist the help of lawyers from those countries too. This whole thing was starting to really rack up a lot of legal fees for the Society, and they tried to back out several times and tell Florence there was nothing they could do, but Florence was persistent to the point where the Society members seemed almost scared of her, so the legal battles continued. After years of back and forth, an official hearing had finally been scheduled for March 31st, 1924. But we're not even close to being finished, because this hearing dragged all the way into July, where the German courts finally decided that Prana Film was in the wrong, and Florence demanded they pay her £5,000, or over £250,000, or around 400,000 US dollars in today's money. Of course, Prana couldn't pay that, so they appealed. They went to court again in February of 1925. Florence won the case again, but then Prana appealed again. At this point, Florence knew she wasn't going to get any money out of this, which sucked, but she had a score to settle. So instead of asking for money, she demanded a different form of compensation: the complete annihilation of any and all copies of Nosferatu. And thus marks one of the only, or perhaps the only, case of a film being legally requested to be destroyed. And finally, after more delays since Prana also appealed this ruling, the courts decided on July 20th, 1925 that Prana Film had to destroy all film relating to Nosferatu. But this still wasn't the end of it, because despite this ruling, the German courts did literally nothing to make sure that Prana actually destroyed the film. And would you believe it? In October of that same year, Nosferatu rose from the grave again, this time in America. A private organization known as the Film Society was a club that dedicated itself on preserving and showing films among its members. A friend of Florence's was a member of this club and sent Florence a list of films the Film Society were intending to view. And could you believe to learn, one of the films was Nosferatu. Florence sent a formal letter to the Film Society basically telling them that they could not legally show the film, and in return, she received a phone call from the Film Society's organizer, Ivor Montague. Jesus. I guess everyone just had a fuck-ass name back then. But anyway, Ivor basically told Florence to fuck off because since he wasn't showing the film publicly or for a profit, that he had every right to let his members watch it. This was technically true in a legal sense, and they could not prosecute Ivor for owning the film, but they could go after whoever illegally sold the film to Ivor. The problem was that Ivor refused to give up the seller's name. Florence turned to her literary agent, C.A. Bang, I'm not gonna say it, for help. Bang did some sleuthing, and while he couldn't find the name of the guy, he did find out that he tried to sell the film to several theaters in London, but having no luck, he gave the film to the Film Society. And so there was nothing anyone could do. And for the moment, the Film Society still had possession of Nosferatu. But as for my thoughts on Nosferatu as a piece of art and as an adaptation of Dracula, I think it's a great film, and I'm glad that it survived despite Florence's best efforts. While the film may not really be considered scary by today's standards, it still manages to be very eerie and atmospheric. The expressionist style is visually striking, and it's very interesting to see a truly monstrous and inhuman version of Dracula that really isn't seen often in Dracula adaptations. While Nosferatu technically is a Dracula adaptation, it really feels more like its own work of fiction that is iconic in its own right. Before we move on to talk about more Draculas, let's take a moment to hear from this video's sponsor. Me! That's right, me. Because who else is stupid enough to try to consume every piece of Dracula media ever created? And I hear if you subscribe to my channel, that I will personally represent you in a court if you ever find yourself engaged in a Dracula-related legal battle. So if you want to protect your vampire copyright and or encroach on someone else's vampire copyright, please give me a like and subscribe, and go check out my various social medias linked in the description below. Thank you! And back to the video. While all the legal battles for Nosferatu were going down, Florence was also dealing with another adaptation, this time, luckily, an authorized one. In 1924, an actor-manager, Hamilton Dean, from a theater troupe with a less than stellar track record, approached Florence for the stage rights for Dracula. It wasn't much money, but Florence needed it. She also remembered Bram's first attempt at a stage adaptation that ended turning out like shit, so she had some hope that Hamilton might make something halfway decent. So she granted Hamilton the license, with the agreement being that Hamilton would take 10% of the royalties, while Florence and Hamilton's backers would take the remaining 90%. Tough deal. But despite this, Hamilton was excited about the play. He tried to find a writer to adapt the novel for him since he had no writing experience, but having no luck with that and then coming down with an illness that left him bedridden, Hamilton decided to adapt the novel himself. And adapt it he did in a total of 4 weeks. Hamilton had rewritten the story to be a drawing room play, a type of play that primarily or entirely takes place in one location, most likely an upper-class Victorian drawing room, meaning that he cut all sequences in Romania entirely. Another big change Hamilton made included gender-bending the character Quincy Morris to allow for more female roles in consideration of his theater troupe. And one of the biggest and most iconic changes Hamilton made to the story was the characterization of Dracula. Since he adapted the play to be a drawing room melodrama, the content had to match the style, meaning all characters had to at least put on airs of being members of polite society. And so the crusty, dusty lizard man Dracula of the book was transformed into the tuxedo-wearing gentleman we associate with Dracula today. The story also had to be adapted to fit censorship laws for the time. For example, Hamilton wasn't allowed to show Dracula being staked through through the heart explicitly, he instead had to imply it. So in an impressive display of theater trickery, Hamilton commissioned stage magician Leslie Drayton to help rebuild Dracula's coffin into a disappearing cabinet trick. How it worked was that when Jonathan raised his knife to stab down at Dracula, Dracula would pull a lever in the coffin, causing him to fall through a trap door and simultaneously release clouds of dust into the air, therefore making it seem as if the actor had vanished into dust after being killed, just like in the novel. The only problem with this, though, is that this trick would cause Dracula's actor to get absolutely obliterated with dust, which would have been fine if he didn't have to come back out on stage a few seconds later to do curtain call, a crusty, dusty Dracula once more. So Hamilton's solution was to have a second person who wasn't allowed to do curtain call double as Dracula. And the man to take up the mantle was none other than the mastermind of this trick, Leslie Drayton himself, who was noteworthily much shorter than the actor playing Dracula. One of Hamilton's troupe members, Ivan Butler, recalled how fucking funny it was that backstage after the show, you could see this tall, suave Dracula standing next to this little tiny dusty Dracula. And speaking of Dracula, let's talk about his iconic appearance. The costume included a wig with the hair slicked back except for 2 strands of gray hair that curled up slightly like little devil horns. While this feature isn't typically seen in later adaptations of Dracula, his next and most associated feature is. The Hamilton Dean play is the first adaptation of Dracula to give the character his iconic high-collared cape. This costume decision was for a practical reason, as it allowed the actor to hide himself from the audience while still being on stage, making it seem as if he disappeared or appeared out of thin air. This effect was achieved by the high collar obscuring the back of the actor's head when he turned away from the audience, therefore allowing him to actually slide out of the cape, leaving it on stage as he disappeared down a trapdoor or a wall panel. I love the use of stage magic in this show, it sounds so cool. Hamilton Dean had originally planned to play Dracula himself, but after finishing the script, Hamilton realized that Dracula's role was actually pretty small compared to the rest of the cast, so he instead gave himself the much larger part of Van Helsing. The rest of the cast was rounded out by Hamilton's theater troupe, including Edmund Blake as Dracula and Hamilton's future wife, Dora Mary Patrick, as Mina. After the premiere, Hamilton's version of Dracula was such a success that theaters in London were offering him production deals, but Hamilton turned them down because he preferred his traveling shows with his troupe and was afraid that the harsh London critics would tear his little gimmicky show to shreds. But after the continued success of Dracula, making it by far the most famous and profitable show Hamilton had ever produced, Hamilton eventually agreed to debut in London after 3 years of tours. Funnily enough, opening on Valentine's Day of 1927. But unfortunately, Hamilton was right about how London critics would react to his show, because while the allure of both spectacle and Dracula himself kept audiences coming back for more, as far as actual artistry, this play was pretty bad. Like I mentioned earlier, Hamilton had no experience writing, so all the dialogue sounded very strange, stilted, and at times just fucking stupid. There's also the fact that Hamilton's troupe had a less than stellar reputation, not because they had done anything, but because they were all mostly mediocre actors. Not even Hamilton himself was very good. According to a review by The Times, Hamilton, who played Van Helsing, forgot to continue using his character's accent during the second half of the play. But knowing that gimmicks were the strongest allure to his show, Hamilton leaned farther into them. After a newspaper joked that Hamilton should hire a nurse to attend all his showings, Hamilton actually did it, hiring a uniformed nurse from the Queen Alexandria Hospital to attend each performance, and letting the audience know that she was on hand with smelling salts and brandy should they start feeling faint. And once again, according to troupe member Ivan Butler, many people actually did utilize the nurse when the play caused them to feel faint, a vast majority of them being men.
Oh. All right.
But despite the new press, Hamilton was sure that Dracula would close on the West End soon after its premiere due to all the scathing critic reviews. But that didn't happen. Audiences still loved it, and the 300-seat theater that they started in kept selling out every seat so often that the play eventually had to move to a bigger theater. Dracula continued to run on the West End for the next 5 months, with no signs of stopping anytime soon. But Hamilton didn't like being confined to one theater and wanted to go back to a traveling production. But Hamilton's financial backer, Harry Warburton, didn't want Dracula to leave the West End since it was raking in so much cash there. But Hamilton was dead set on leaving. And so Harry decided to go behind Hamilton's back and strike a deal with Florence Stoker to keep the show playing on the West End with a new cast without Hamilton's knowledge. But Hamilton did find out about this, and now it was his turn to engage in a legal battle with Florence. Over the next year, they eventually came to an agreement, and Hamilton continued touring his play. Unfortunately, no copies of Hamilton Dean's adaptation exist today, so I cannot read it or review it, so we're done here. In 1922 in Paris, a music student, Aaron Copland, and his roommate, a writer, director, and critic, Harold Clurman, went to the movies. The movie they were seeing? Nosferatu. Inspired by what he had just seen and pushed by his music teacher, Nadia Bollinger, Aaron decided to compose a ballet based on the film. He recruited his roommate Harold to write the story for the ballet, and he came up with Les Necromanciens, or The Necromancer, about a sorcerer who brings dead bodies back to life to dance for his amusement. The title was later changed to Grogh after the main character, the sorcerer. After he was finished composing for a full orchestra, Aaron arranged his work into a piano four-hands performance that he played with his music teacher Nadia at a party in either 1924 or 1925. There's some disputes there, but it's generally cited that 1925 was the year he finished the composition. But now that his work was done, Aaron could approach ballet companies to maybe convince them to perform his work. But he never did. Instead, Aaron shelved the project and removed it from his catalog entirely in 1927. Aaron did revisit the work on occasion, though. In 1927, he extracted parts of Grogh and reworked them into a new orchestration called Dance Symphony. He would do this again 2 more times to create the orchestrations for Corday Funèbre and sections for another ballet, Hear Ye, Hear Ye. In 1932, he would revise Grogh, but once again did nothing with it. I found conflicting statements on this next part, but according to Interlude in 1971, Aaron reinstated Grogh into his catalog at the request of the director of the Eastman Philharmonic, Howard Hanson, but it was then lost and not found again until composer Oliver Nussmann discovered it. But according to AllMusic, after Grogh was shelved in 1932, it went missing, no reinstatement to the catalog, and it wasn't until Aaron's assistant, Robert Caltabiano, reached out to Oliver Nussmann to search for the score that Oliver found it while digging through files in the Library of Congress. But either way, we know that Oliver was the one to unearth Grogh again. And in 1992, Oliver conducted a full orchestra to play Aaron's score. This would mark the first time Grogh had been performed in 72 years since that party in 1925. And it was the first time it was performed the way Aaron had originally intended it. Sadly, Aaron wasn't there to witness this because he had died 2 years earlier in 1990, after a long and influential career as a composer. Grogh is a ballet in 1 act, so the score is pretty short, lasting only 29 minutes. But you can listen to the full 1992 recording on YouTube, and I would highly recommend it because this shit slaps. The music is so beautifully composed, there's so many crashes, high strings, and low droning bass that really make your skin crawl. And the dissonance? If you know me, you know I love a dissonant chord. They're so crunchy. This is the perfect score for the horror genre. I would love to see this score used in a horror film, but even more than that, I would love to see it performed in an actual ballet. Unfortunately, Aaron only ever finished the score, but the other integral part of a ballet, the dancing, was never choreographed. I really hope someone takes up the mantle on this and gets that done because I want to see it so bad. Okay, this is another quick one, but it's also really funny. So, by this time, Hamilton's version of Dracula was in full swing and doing really well, and Florence was not happy. Despite her initial approval of the play, she had grown resentful due to the split royalties and Hamilton's whack-ass adaptation that she thought was an insult to her husband's original vision. So in 1926, Florence commissioned playwright Charles Morel to write her version of a Dracula play, one that would be far more faithful to her husband's work that she could collect the full profits of. While Florence was trying to screw over Hamilton by infringing on his stage copyright, at the same time, Charles finished her play. With the work that she thought would destroy Hamilton once and for all in hand, Florence wasted no time having it premiere in September of 1927. However, this version of Dracula was not the masterpiece Florence thought it was, most likely due to her insistence that it be as close to the book as possible. The play had been adapted into a drawing room play similar to Hamilton's, but in Charles's play, most of the dialogue had been ripped straight from the novel, making the show consist mostly of long stretches of characters monologuing with very little action, which, as you can imagine, was boring as hell. There was also some strange changes. The show kept referencing Shakespeare plays for some reason. Mina sleepwalks instead of Lucy, and she also craves raw meat. Girl, you're a vampire, not a zombie. The hell are you doing? They also had to make edits to the story based on censorship laws at the time, which means they had to axe the scene where Mina is burned by a communion wafer and the scene where Dracula forces her to drink his blood. Suffice to say, Florence's commissioned play was a huge flop that only performed once, and no copies of the script exist today. So Hamilton's play was still popping off despite Florence's attempt at sabotage, and there was one man in particular who was very interested in it. Horace Liverwright was a very successful Broadway producer and loved the broad appeal of Hamilton's Dracula, seeing it 4 times during a winter visit to London. However, Horace was also very aware that Hamilton's script was really ass. But that was just a minor setback in Horace's eyes. He knew that Dracula could be a huge hit in America with all its sexual and sacrilegious subtext. Horace had a bit of a reputation for trying to slip risque plays past the Broadway censors. In fact, at the same time he was pursuing Dracula for a Broadway production, he was also trying to produce another play, The Captives, which contained an explicit lesbian relationship. He couldn't get that past the censors, of course, but Dracula was a different story. Horace went to Florence and presented her with the opportunity to present Dracula on Broadway, with the condition that Horace could hire someone to revise Hamilton's script. But right off the bat, Florence did not like Horace, who she saw as a flashy American. Because of this, Horace was forced to negotiate with Florence through the man he had hired as his playwright, John L. Balderston. Eventually, Horace, John, and Florence's agent, C.A. Bang, came to an agreement in early May of 1927, and Horace had John begin his rewrite of the script. John Balderston was burdened with the very difficult task of taking a script that he described as, quote, dramatized very badly, end quote, and turn it into something palatable by July 1st, giving him only around a month and a half to fix this thing. John had also asked to remain uncredited, worried that the subject matter of Dracula would damage his reputation, but eventually he did decide he wanted to be credited before the show opened. John had been promised a $300 advance for rewriting the script, or roughly $5,600 in today's money, but still hadn't received his payment by the time he finished the play in early June, a whole month ahead of schedule. He wrote to his wife Marion explaining that he knew that Horace, despite his success on Broadway, often had trouble with money and he would not send him his finished draft until Horace paid up. But then John had more bullshit he had to deal with because suddenly C.A. Bang and Florence were refusing to hand over the rights to Hamilton Dean's script unless John agreed to send them his script for review and approval, which was not something they had agreed upon in their contract. John refused to do this, of course, but wrote to Horace that they could honestly do without the rights to the Hamilton Dean script since he had basically rewritten the whole thing from the ground up, using only 20 of the original lines. Horace loved the script revision, but Bang and Florence decided to reject it for use in London, deciding that Hamilton's version was good enough, but this ended up biting them in the ass when enthusiasm for the Hamilton play eventually died down, while the John Balderston version went on to thrive in America. Now that the pre-production was done, it was time to move on to production, which means it's time for casting! Horace originally offered the role of Dracula to Raymond Huntley, the actor who originated the role during the London production, but Raymond turned him down because he thought the pay wasn't good enough and continued to act in the London play that would eventually close 3 months after the Broadway premiere. Whoopsie! However, Horace also offered the London Renfield actor Bernard Jukes the same role on Broadway, and he accepted, going on to perform as Renfield both in London and on Broadway for more than 4,000 performances. Hot damn! But Raymond Huntley turning down the role ended up being a blessing in disguise because it left the role open for another man who would no doubt become the most famous and influential actor to ever play Dracula. Bela Lugosi. My man! Bela Lugosi began his acting career in his home country of Hungary, where he coincidentally had some very early ties to Dracula when he starred in a 1917 film alongside Karoli Lajszé, the director of Dracula Halal. Small world. When Bela first came to America after being run out of his country for trying to organize an actors union, GOAT, he did not speak a lick of English and instead learned his lines for roles phonetically. And since that seemed to work so well for him, he basically decided that he really didn't need to learn English. So he didn't, until much later, that is. And he apparently had so much success with acting based on phonics alone that he was like, I don't get why any actor bothers to learn English. This clearly is the way to do it. Even before Bela was approached by Horace for the role, he claimed that earlier that year he was approached by a Broadway director, Gene D. Williams, for a different production of Dracula he was attempting to put on, and felt that Bela was, quote, the only actor in America suitable for the part, end quote. But there were issues with securing copyright from England, and the show would never be produced. It's unclear which play from England Gene was attempting to get the copyright for, but it's speculated that it may have been the illegal 1917 play or the 1927 Charles Morel play commissioned by Florence Stoker. But either way, the deal fell through. But Bela claims that after this play failed to be produced, Gene and Horace happened to run into each other during the summer of 1927. And hearing that Horace was looking for an actor for the title role of his production, Gene glazed Bela so convincingly for the part that Horace auditioned and hired Bela immediately. Some sources say that Bela originally turned down the offer since the role didn't have that many lines, but either way, he would go on to originate Dracula on Broadway. However, during rehearsals, Bela was giving a less than stellar performance. He still struggled with English at the time and was still relying on learning his lines phonetically. He even had to be given directions in French so he could understand what he was supposed to do. This wasn't all bad though, because it did lead to the slow, staccato, heavily accented inflection that has become so synonymous with Dracula today. But this compromise did result in Bela's performance being very lackluster during rehearsals, which was a big problem for Horace since he was relying on Bela to give the performance of a lifetime for a potential financial backer for his show. If Bela failed, it would mean no funding, which would mean there'd be no show. And as the deadline got closer and closer, everyone, Horace, cast, crew, started to freak the fuck out. Apparently, the only time Bela showed any passion was when he was yelling at another actor for not saying their cue right and making him miss an entrance. This resulted in everyone being maybe a little bit intimidated of him and maybe not wanting to bring up his maybe not so good acting. But with literally everything on the line for this backer's performance and only a week left to get their shit together, Horace had to talk to Bela about his concerns. After he was finished clearing the air, Bela just stared at him. And I'm just gonna go ahead and read directly from my source about what happened next because you need to hear it. Mr. Liverite, Bela began in a tone verging on condescension. I understand your concern, but the performance is not until a week from tomorrow evening. The last words were delivered in a deliberate, almost sinister tone that would have easily sent the shudders through the cast had they been present. Bela leaned forward, unintentionally menacing, towering over Liverite to emphasize his point. Now we work for precision. Our lines must be perfect. Yes, we saved the atmosphere for a week from tomorrow evening. Jesus Christ, no wonder everyone was scared of him. I wouldn't have wanted to say shit to him either. But on another note, I hope this interaction proved to Horace that Bela was born to play Dracula because holy cow. But if Horace did still have any doubts leading up to the performance, they were put to rest once the backer arrived and Bela showed the fuck up. They fucking did it, gang. Trust the process. Dracula opened on Broadway at Fulton Theater on October 5th, 1927. Overall, critics liked this one a lot more than they liked Hamilton's version, but reviews were still overall mixed due to some blunders. Like when the wolf version of Dracula attacks Lucy, they used this big werewolf puppet and it made the audience laugh because, yeah, that does sound fucking goofy. But overall, the Broadway Dracula still had a great draw, especially due to Bela's undeniable sexual appeal. Now that Dracula was a huge success, Horace went into overdrive with advertisements and marketing stunts. He commissioned artist Vernon Short to create an image of an almost fish-like Dracula for some reason, but it was used everywhere, on posters, pamphlets, flyers, and even sold as a mask. Horace even borrowed the gimmick of having a nurse worse at his performances, and while not nearly as many people fainted at his show compared to Hamilton's, he did manage to get a few fainters. I guess Americans are just built different. In later showings, Horace even offered a prorated refund if you fainted during the show and couldn't continue. Dracula became such a huge success on Broadway that Horace subcontracted the play to the West Coast and then started a tour version in the Eastern Seaboard and the Midwest. By 1929, Dracula had grossed nearly $2 million, or nearly $38 million in today's money. Besides Bella, the rest of the Broadway cast was rounded out by Terrence Neal as Jonathan, Herbert Bunston as Dr. Seward, Edward Van Sloan as Van Helsing, and Horace's lady love, Dorothy Peterson, as Lucy. And I know I already said that Renfield's actor was played by Bernard Jukes, but I just want to mention his character is described as a repulsive youth, which genuinely made me laugh out loud when I read it. You may have noticed that there's no Mina in this version, and that's because John Balderson decided to swap Mina and Lucy's names since he thought Lucy was more fit for the main character, since it was the perfect mix of innocent but also dark, you know, like Lucifer. But now, let's talk about the plot, because this play was super easy to find and read online for free, unlike some other plays out there. So let's talk about this adaptation. Dracula is a 3-act play, with the first act taking place in the library of Dr. Seward's sanatorium. It opens with Jonathan worriedly asking a maid about Lucy's condition before Dr. Seward enters the room. The play's time period has been updated to match the times since Jonathan mentions jumping in his car to get to the sanatorium. Dr. Seward's character has been updated to be Lucy's father instead of her suitor, kinda gross, but whatever. And he and Jonathan discuss Lucy's health condition, mentioning that Mina had died after experiencing the same symptoms. See? Mina is here. She's just dead because she's actually Lucy, and Lucy is Mina. That makes sense, right? They briefly talk about Renfield since they can hear him laughing, and Dr. Seward is like, yeah, he eats bugs, and I'm gonna send him away soon, so don't worry about it. Seward says that he's handing Lucy's case over to his colleague Van Helsing since he knows more about mysterious illnesses and stuff. Also, the location has been changed from Whitby to Purley, but I'm not really sure why. But Seward and Jonathan then talk about the Count, who comes to visit Lucy often and has even offered to give his blood to Lucy to help with her anemia. Jonathan goes to Lucy and Seward greets Van Helsing. The two talk about Lucy's symptoms for a bit before Renfield interrupts them. An attendant comes to take Renfield back to his room, and Seward mentions that this isn't the first time he's escaped. Last time, he tried to break into Count Dracula's house. Renfield mentions that he's glad he's being sent away, but before he can explain why, a bat starts banging on the window, and Renfield starts apologizing to the bat, saying like, don't worry, I wasn't gonna say shit, I ain't no snitch, and then tries to murk Van Helsing, saying that he knows too much, and the attendant drags Renfield away. Jonathan and Lucy enter the scene, and Van Helsing examines her. She tells him that she has strange dreams every night, then wakes up feeling weak. You know, the usual vampire shit. And now, Count Dracula is here, and Lucy seems super into him. Dracula mentions that he loves England because there's so much more opportunity, and does like an office-style turn to the camera. Once Dracula leaves, Van Helsing brings up that he suspects the occult as the cause of Lucy's condition, specifically a vampire. Van Helsing sets a trap to see who the vampire is, and would you believe it? It's Dracula! We're now on to Act 2, which takes place in Lucy's boudoir. The maid and the attendant have a pretty pointless conversation that's just recapping the last act, and then the attendant goes off to find Renfield, who's escaped again. Seward and the maid have a brief conversation where they more or less confirm the Bloofer lady, aka vampire Mina Lucy, is in this play before the maid is left alone, and then Dracula shows up. He hypnotizes her to do whatever he says, then leaves. Van Helsing comes in with Seward and Jonathan, and we learn that Dracula came to England in a plane in this version. How modern of him. Also bringing along 6 boxes of Transylvania soil. Since a vampire needs to sleep in their native soil, Van Helsing says that if they find and destroy all these boxes, then they will destroy Dracula. But turns out that rambunctious little scamp Renfield was listening to their plan this whole time, but he's not here to spy, but to switch sides. But he does a shit job because every time he tries to tell the gang some information, Bat Drac slaps himself against the window to shut him up. Renfield's basically only able to tell Lucy she should leave before he goes back to his cell. Everyone but Van Helsing leaves the stage, then Dracula shows up and smashes a mirror by chucking a vase at it when Van Helsing says he didn't notice his reflection. Subtle, dude. Dracula and Van Helsing share a very homoerotically charged scene where they keep trying to intimidate each other. It's giving heated rivalry for real. And Dracula jumps out the window. "You can't run from this, bitch. I know what you are."
Say it.
Gay. Lucy comes in and they talk about Vampire Mina again, and Van Helsing promises to take care of that and gives Lucy wolfsbane and a cross to protect herself. But then Renfield escapes again! Jesus, guys, get a grip! So all the men leave to go take care of that, leaving Lucy alone with the maid. Dracula shows up, obviously, and the maid takes the wolfsbane and cross from Lucy, letting Dracula into the room. Act 3. We're back in the library and there's been a time skip. Van Helsing and Seward talk about having already destroyed 5 of the 6 boxes of Earth, and also murked Vampire Mina. Then, Renfield shows up again, once more asking for them to save him while not offering any info in return. My god, dude, you're really starting to piss me off. Jonathan and Lucy come in. Lucy is very vivacious now, suspiciously so, and she thinks it's funny when Renfield starts tweaking out. Lucy tries to bite Jonathan, but Van Helsing stops her with a cross. She snaps out of it and makes all the boys promise to kill her if she turns. The boys use Renfield to lure Dracula, and when he shows up to kill Renfield, they step in and hold him hostage with a cross with the plan to keep him there until the sun rises. Dracula escapes though, and the boys instead plan to kill Renfield to stop him from turning into a vampire when he dies, but Renfield runs away. They follow him and find Dracula's lair, where they stake him through the heart and kill him. Lucy shows up there for some reason, and it's a happy ending. Van Helsing addresses the audience and warns them to watch out for vampires. I actually really enjoyed this drawing room mystery version of Dracula. I would love to see it performed, although this version is rarely produced these days. I thought the abridged version of the story worked really well, and I'll admit I'm a huge cuck for a slutty gentleman Dracula, obviously. Really, my only problem with the script was that they switched Mina and Lucy's names. Sorry, I'm a purist. And also, I felt the ending scene where they killed Dracula to be very rushed, but I guess that makes sense due to all the censorship at the time. But I cannot excuse Lucy just randomly showing up in Dracula's lair at the end. I get it, they didn't want to do another scene change just to show us that Lucy's okay now, but it just don't make any fucking sense. And with that, I am done with this iteration of Dracula adaptations. Big shout out to David J. Skal and his book, Hollywood Gothic. I got so much background information for this video from that book that I couldn't possibly have found anywhere else. It was such a big help for both this video and later videos I have planned for this series. And if you want to check out my other sources, they're listed in the description. Alright, and with that, that concludes part 2 of consuming every piece of Dracula media ever created. Make sure you come back for part 3 because if you thought there couldn't possibly be any more Dracula copyright drama, you would unfortunately be so wrong. As always, thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you subscribe, I will personally represent you in court if you ever find yourself engaged in a Dracula-related legal battle. But if the idea of engaging in a lengthy and costly legal battle for the sake of destroying the people who dared to encroach on your copyright or misrepresent your intellectual property isn't worth it to you, don't even worry about it. Bye!